Culloden Moor, April 16th, 1746. The armies of Hanover and Stuart dropped to face each other. The Hanoverian forces of the British government are led by King George II's son, the Duke of Cumberland. The Redcoats stand in disciplined lines, muskets, cannons, and horses at the ready. Facing them down are 5,000 Jacobites, the army of the House of Stuart, led by a man who'd come to be known as the Young Pretender, Bonnie Prince Charlie. They boast Highland clansmen backed up by a backbone professional Irish and Scottish regiments. The battle begins with a terrific roar as artillery on either side lights up. The last battle to be fought on British soil, the Battle of Culloden, was about to begin. Hello and welcome to the Scottish History Podcast. I'm your host Peter. So this is my first episode where I'm actually going solo, as I've relocated across the country, so we had to change our format slightly. So I hope you enjoy this. For this episode, I've chose to look at the Battle of Culloden, which was the climactic end to a dynastic struggle that had been going on for about 60 years. And the battle was fought at the end of the final Jacobite uprising in 1745. But before we go any further, what do we actually mean when we talk about a Jacobite? A Jacobite is someone who supported James Stuart II of England, or the 7th of Scotland, and his descendants in the claims for the British throne. The word comes from Jacob or Jacobus, which is Latin for James, so a Jacobite is literally a follower of James. So just a little bit of background here. So when we're talking about James the Stuart II, now he was the last Roman Catholic ruler of the kingdoms of England, Scotland and Ireland. And he was deposed by a man named William of Orange, who came over in 1688 and deposed him in what's called the Glorious Revolution. Now, ever since then, his followers, which include his son and his grandson, had been warring against the British Crown, trying to claim what they saw as their birthright. You have James Stuart, confusingly, King James Stuart's son, who's known as the Old Pretender, who led a series of uprisings against the Crown. And then we have his son, so James the Stuart II's grandson, Bonnie Prince Charlie, and he's the man who fights at Culloden and who we're going to be looking at today. So this man, Charles Edward Stuart, is an exile. He's the son of the exiled king, the Old Pretender, and he was born in Rome and brought up in a Jacobite court abroad. And all through his life, he's been told that he is the rightful ruler of the kingdoms of Scotland, England, and Ireland, and that he's had his throne taken away from him. So he's going to do anything that he can to seize back his birthright. And he gets his chance when the French are fighting with the British in Flanders. He sees his chance and he sails over to Scotland. So landing in the Highlands, him and his followers try and win round the nobility of Scotland. And they do this just with promises of French aid and his own charm. Now what's quite interesting here is to have, so he's in the Highlands, so it's mostly the Highland clans at this point that he's trying to win round to start his rebellion. And it's quite interesting to look at why some of the clans joined him, and there's actually quite a lot of clans that fought against him or stayed neutral and just kept out of the fight altogether. So why did some of the clans fight or not fight? The Acts of Union that were passed in 1707 saw the joining of Scotland and England, and this was quite unpopular in some circles. Some people were for it, but others were against it. There's the famous Robbie Burns quote that, we were bought and sold for English gold. So some people in Scotland would have seen this as a betrayal and a selling out to the English in a way. And there's also opposition to the Hanoverian government, as they could be seen as usurpers, as William of Orange came in and took the throne by force. And this could go the other way as well, that some of the Highland clans might have seen Bonnie Prince Charlie as the usurper, coming on and trying to raise a rebellion, trying to upset the status quo. So I've got a couple of specific examples here of some clans that fought against Bonnie Prince Charlie, and some who tried to raise the standard for him but was stopped. It says that Clan Campbell of Auchnabrec, along with Clan MacDougall, would have actually come to the aid of Bonnie Prince Charlie, but they were stopped by the Campbells of Argyll. So this is more like a political motive for these clans not to fight. We also see the chief of Clan MacTavishad was actually put in prison by the government solely for the reason to stop him rising up for Bonnie Prince Charlie. So there's a lot of political reasons in here why the clans fought or might not have fought. And what I've got here is actually a contemporary account by a chap named Donald Mackay, who was from Glen Urquhart, and he was a volunteer soldier in the Jacobites, so someone who voluntarily went and fought for Bonnie Prince Charlie. Now, unfortunately, in the letter, it doesn't actually mention why he fights, but I thought I'd read it to you. I'm not going to give you the whole letter. It's quite long, and I've kind of cut it down and paraphrased it a little bit. But just to kind of give you an indication of some of the popular feeling at the time for people who were supporting the Jacobites. So Donald Mackay was a young boy who joined the Jacobites with his father and his brother on the very day of the Battle of Culloden. He's actually got quite an interesting story after as well. After the defeat, he escaped, and he actually surrendered, was later shipped off to the West Indies. He then escaped again and became a stowaway until he reached Jamaica, and then he started working on the plantations before finally returning to Scotland as an old man. And this is when we find he's writing his letter. So this is a letter that was originally written in Gaelic, and it's been translated into English. Hopefully I can post the full letter online for you guys to read, because it is quite interesting, but unfortunately I don't have the time to give you the whole thing. So here it is. I am now an old man, and it is a long, long time since the years of Charles. But if you want a story, I shall tell you about the Battle of Culloden. News came to our glen that Duke William and the Red soldiers were approaching. No sooner had we got the news that my father, brother and myself, and quite a number of others from the glen, left to go to the aid of the prince. They put us in the Glengarry regiment, where we had many relatives and friends. When we reached the army, a great shout of joy went up, welcoming us. Prince Charles himself, riding a white horse, was a fine fellow, a true prince. There has not been seen, and there will never be seen again in the Highlands, a prince of his equal. So it's very romantic at heart, this letter. I don't think he would have been thinking this at the time. Obviously, he's had, many years to think over, and he's, looking back with rose-tinted goggles on this time. But it does go to show a little bit of the kind of popular opinion there was for the Jacobite cause there. At the end of the day, Bonnie Prince Charlie gained enough support to raise the Jacobite flag at Glenfinnan in August 1745. And the rebellion against the Hanoverian king had begun in earnest. Barely a month later, Edinburgh would be in the Jacobite hands, and the young pretender would score a decisive defeat over the royal army at the Battle of Prestonpans. Everything was actually looking up for the young prince as his army marched into England. He hoped that a quick victory against the government would gather support from the English Jacobites, as the majority of the government army was still fighting on the continent. They penetrated deep into England, and by December had reached Derby, only 125 miles from London. However, the lack of support from English Jacobites and pressure from the Duke of Cumberland's force meant that the prince had to withdraw north for fear of losing his army. On returning to Scotland, the Jacobites again vanquished the government forces at the Battle of Falkirk on the 17th of January 1746. Due to confusion that followed, however, the Jacobites were not able to capitalise on the victory, and the decision was made to retreat further north into Scotland. There they would gather their strength over the winter months, and the Jacobite campaign would start again in the spring. Hearing of the government's defeat at Falkirk, Cumberland, who had recently returned from campaigning in Europe, raced north to take command of the royal army. The Jacobites' campaign in Scotland had led their forces stretched thin, so when the prince finally decided to meet Cumberland in battle, a move that his advisors actually warned against, he did not have the full strength of his cause behind him. The two forces met at Culloden Moor, near to Nairn and Aberdeen, where the boggy ground was unfavourable to the Jacobites, who relied on a fierce charge to break their enemies. Cumberland had the advantage in artillery and had drilled his men to face the charge of the Jacobites, and it was this and other factors that led to the government forces completely routing the Jacobites on the field. What I'm hoping to do in this episode is dispel a few of the popular myths that surround the battle. There's a lot of romance and folklore that surrounds the Jacobite cause as a whole, and you have to be careful not to get sucked into the fantasy and rather focus on the facts. So the first one I want to look at is, contrary to some popular belief, none of the clans at Culloden actually wore specific clan tartan. Now that's not to say they didn't wear tartan at all. They did, but what it was, having a tartan that was specific to each clan wasn't actually something that was started until George IV's visit to Scotland in 1822, which saw a revival in Highland culture. What people would have worn was tartan made from local materials, so each tartan would have been different, but it wouldn't have been, the same pattern all the time. You might have had where the Campbells were from, they would use their local materials, or the Argyll clan, they would have theirs. So you might be able to pick up where they were from by the materials they used, but you couldn't look at a tartan and know specifically that is the clan tartan. Another common misconception about the Jacobite risings is that they were conflicts fought between England and Scotland. Now, what there was men from both countries fought on both sides. So you had there was Highland regiments that fought for the government, the Argyll militia. They were Highlanders fighting for the Hanoverians for the government side. You also, you had the Highland clansmen who are the kind of the poster boys of Bonnie Prince Charlie's army, and everyone kind of thinks, oh, it's a Highland, it's the Highlanders versus the English or whatever. That's not actually true. There was Highlanders and Lowlanders from Scotland on both sides, so it wasn't just it was more of a civil war, if you will, rather than a straight Scotland versus England fight. So now we're going to look at the actual battle itself. The shock tactic of the Jacobite army was called the Highland Charge. Now, in this, the men would throw themselves forward at the enemy at top speed, brandishing broadswords, shields, pistols, and daggers, all while screaming bloody murder in a war cry. And this was intended to intimidate the enemy and get the Jacobites into close quarters where their ferocity could be unleashed. Now, obviously, that's not something that you want hurtling towards you. So, in anticipation of this, Cumberland had actually been drilling his men to specifically combat this type of combat. So what the redcoats would be in blocks, and the men were instructed to hold their fire until the Jacobites were within effective firing range, fire one volley from their muskets, and then turn to the right and bayonet the man to their right. If you imagine a Jacobite charging, usually be right-handed, so the right arm would be raised up. So what the redcoat do then charge and stab the man in the unprotected. He's got his sword lifted up, so he'd stab him in the unprotected kind of upper arm, just below the armpit area, and this for negating a shield which would usually be held on the left hand. Now you can imagine this must have taken quite some discipline to do. You're your basic redcoat soldier in the line. You would have to ignore the man charging at you and actively, look away from him and trust the man to your left that he's going to take care of him. So, the Duke of Cumberland had been drilling his men very effectively, and obviously this isn't a perfect tactic. It's not going to work like clockwork. It's not going to be exactly how you plan it, but on the whole, it was very, very effective in, negating most of the Highland Charge. So I've got another contemporary account here from an Edward Lynn. He was a soldier in the government army, specifically the 21st Royal Scots Fusiliers, and he was in the government front line. And his account of the Highland Charge is quite different from what I thought it would be. The way he's talking about it makes it sound like they were drilled to fight this charge, and that they were very confident in their abilities to beat it. So I'll give it to you again. I can post the full letter online. This is just an excerpt from it. They came up very boldly and very fast, all in a cloud together. Sword in hand, they fired their pieces and flung them away, but we gave them so warm a reception that we kept continual cross-firing upon them with our small arms. At the start of the battle, the young pretender had his forces stretched out across the Highlands, so he doesn't actually meet the government forces with his full strength. He's urged by his advisors to retreat, but he pushes on and engages Cumberland's forces on unsuitable ground for the Jacobites. Now they know this, so to try and gain the upper hand, they attempt a night attack, and they're eager to catch the enemy forces flat-footed. So what they do, in the pitch black, they gather together a raiding party, and they try and march in the government camp to, get surprise, have the element of surprise and get the jump on them. But in the pitch black, the parties get separated, and many men end up actually getting lost. Now, obviously, as dawn's breaking, the officers can see that the element of surprise is long past, so they call it off, and the dejected, the tired, and must have been hungry as well, Jacobite troops, they all trudge back to their lines. And now, of course, if you've been up all night marching, and now when day breaks, the government forces line up, you're then expected to fight as well. So the Jacobite right flank tries to move into a more favourable position, but what this actually does is this disrupts the entire line and leads to large gaps opening in the Jacobite army. And seeing this, one of the British officers tries to position his dragoons over some walls in an attempt to actually outflank the Jacobite army on, which would be the government forces left, but the Jacobite right. So the Jacobites open the artillery barrage, and they're trying to destroy the government cannons. But the Duke of Cumberland orders his superior artillery to return fire, and the Jacobite artillery is destroyed. Maybe one of the defining moments in the battle is when the Duke of Cumberland orders his cannons to switch from firing cannonballs to firing canister or grape shot instead. Now, what canister or grape shot is a bag filled with little musket balls, and it's packed into the cannon and fired, and when the bag hits the ground, these balls, there's usually about 30 or 40 of them, they go out in a big shower, and it's basically just there to scythe down infantry. It was absolutely deadly, and accounted for quite a lot of the casualties in the Jacobite army. And there's actually been some battlefield archaeology done where they found grape shot and musket balls that were fired, that have just turned up round about the kind of Culloden Visitor Centre where the battle actually took place. And to give you a little bit of an idea about what it would be like to be in the face of the grape shot, here is an account of James Johnson, a Jacobite officer. 4 pieces of cannon, which they got to play upon our right with grape shot, close to the muskets, produced a fire so terrible that they mowed down our right wing, as if they cut down a field of corn and swept away our whole ranks. The Jacobites would face this withering fire for 30 minutes, while Bonnie Prince Charlie waited for the Hanoverians to advance. While the marshy terrain actually kept casualties to a minimum, the fire does begin to take a toll on the Jacobites' morale. So the Highland chiefs are furious at this point in this inaction, and they press for the charge and the ability to actually take the fight to the enemy. So the order is given, and the Jacobites rush forward and break upon the government lines in a clash of steel and the crack of musket. The left flank was actually lagging behind, with the MacDonalds rumoured to have declined the charge as they were insulted that they weren't given a prime position on the battlefield. Now, unfortunately, this would prove a fatal decision, as due to the longer distance they had to cover, they were cut down by musket and cannon fire. So deadly was the hail of fire coming from the government troops that it was said that the Redcoats barely took their muskets from their shoulders. Fierce fighting now raged as both sides fought in a vicious melee. The Jacobites that broke through the first government line, which consisted of the Atholl and Loch Earn regiments, were peppered with musket fire from the second and forced to withdraw, and they would lose roughly 700 men in just 2 to 3 minutes. Seeing the Jacobites' left flank deteriorating, Cumberland decides to press the advantage. Dragoons are sent in to hound the struggling Jacobites, but the boggy ground doesn't actually lend itself well to horses, and they make slow progress. With the Jacobite line crumbling and the government forces closing in around him, the prince calls the retreat. With a rearguard action being fought by the Royal Ecossaise and the Irish Picarettes, the Jacobite army retreats, defeated and bloodied from the field of battle. Battle lasted roughly 45 minutes, and it really spelled the end for the Jacobites here. So the next day, any surviving Jacobites met at Ruthven Barracks, and they receive orders to the prince to shift for themselves as he makes his own escape west. Looking at the casualties, with the government army, it was actually fairly low, around 50 dead and 260 wounded, whereas Prince Charles' army lost anywhere between 1,000 and 1,500 men, so a massive difference there. You can see how these losses also affected the morale of both the Jacobites and the government armies. Here we've got Donald Campbell, who was a Highland officer fighting with the government army, and he was guarding the baggage train at the time of the battle, so he was watching very closely, and he wrote an account of it. So I'll give you some of it here. The Scots Fusiliers, who behaved gloriously, made the first break amongst the enemy without the loss of a man. We got all the enemy's cannon, ammunition, and a good part of their baggage. The troops all behaved remarkably well, and not a single man turned his back or came off his line. Even the few wounded men came off in spirits. Our losses were surprisingly small. The only officer of distinction killed was Lord Robert Kerr, and about 40 private men. Of the enemy, at least 1,500 fell in the field, and chased, some say, upwards of 2,000, and that of their best men, mostly clans and numbers of gentlemen. But the story doesn't end there. After the battle, Cumberland's men harried the Jacobites mercilessly across the country, burning homes and driving off cattle. The wounded were murdered where they lay, and any prisoners that were found were shot. One story relates to Cumberland ordering an officer, a James Wolfe, to shoot a wounded man after discovering that he fought for the Jacobites. Wolfe is said that he would have rather resigned his commission than tarnish his honour by carrying out the order. His defiance, however, would come to nothing, as Cumberland simply ordered another man to carry out the execution. Other horror stories circulate about a group of men who were found in a local barn, and they were actually locked in, and the building was set on fire, causing them to burn to death. This grisly tale became known as the Red Barn. Archaeology carried out on the site still has yet to find any remnants of the barn, so it's unsure whether this tale actually is true or not. For the atrocities that were committed on his orders, the Duke of Cumberland earned himself the nickname of Butcher from his enemies, or Sweet William from his allies. Cumberland wasn't complacent though. He quickly consolidated his position by bringing thousands of British soldiers north. They were allowed to pillage the Highland glens, raping the women and putting the houses to the torch. The clan chiefs that had backed the Jacobite cause had their castles burned to the ground and their estates seized. We can see here that the British government was determined to destroy Jacobitism and stamp the king's authority on this rebellious people. The Highland way of life was seen as a large part of this. Speaking Gaelic and having a different fashion marked the Highlanders out to bear the brunt of Cumberland's wrath. Harsh measures were put in place. Highland dress was forbidden to be worn except by regiments in the British Army serving overseas, and anyone found wearing tartan illegally could be executed. The carrying of weapons in the Highlands was also outlawed, and some laws were passed that dissolved the clan system. Even this wasn't enough for some supporters of the Hanoverian cause. In London, Parliament even debated sterilising all women who had supported the Jacobites. Another suggestion offered to clear out the clans and replace them with immigrants from the south, which, if you think about it, isn't too far from the Highland clearances that happened a few years later. These suggestions thankfully weren't acted on, but this would be a small measure of mercy for the people who bore the brunt of the government's repression. Bonnie Prince Charlie, dejected and defeated, was unable to stop any of this, and eventually was smuggled out of Scotland to Europe. Whilst escaping, he sailed to Skye, and this actually served as the inspiration for the folk song, the Skye Boat Song. Europe would be the final resting place, as there would never be another attempt by a Stuart to secure the throne of England, Scotland and Ireland. The legacy left by the Battle of Culloden and Bonnie Prince Charlie's uprisings is, I think, sometimes actually more interesting than the event itself. If you look there, I mean, the Skye Boat Song was inspired by Bonnie Prince Charlie escaping, but there's a lot of other popular culture that has been inspired by Culloden and by the uprisings. One that actually surprised me was the song Loch Lomond. It's a very well-known Scottish folk song. If you don't know it, look it up on YouTube. You'll probably recognise it. Now, there are several interpretations of this song. I personally always thought it was a love song. The lyrics, you take the high road and I'll take the low road, meaning that someone had died, they were taking the high road, it, being heaven or the afterlife, and the low road was, on earth. There's actually some interpretations that this is relating to the Jacobite cause after Culloden, with the high road being the kind of main highway between Scotland and England, that the Jacobite prisoners would have been taken down, as obviously they were a priority to get down to London to be tried, for treason. And there's also some tales that this was actually adorned with Jacobite heads put on pikes, but that might just be a bit of sensationalism. I don't think that's true. So the battle still polarises opinions on each side, and is still sometimes seen as a classic Scottish versus England struggle, kind of in the same way, in the same vein as William Wallace or Robert the Bruce. There's that kind of nationalistic streak through it all. But what really has to be remembered that, first and foremost, this was a dynastic struggle between the House of Stuart and the House of Hanover, who had come over with William of Orange, the Glorious Revolution, deposing, the Catholic monarchs, and their attempts, Bonnie Prince Charlie, the old pretender, their attempts to try and get it back. So that's the episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed that. Just a few quick things to mention here. We have our own website now, which is very exciting. So I'll give you the address here. It's www.scottishhistorypodcast.com. We like to keep things nice and simple for you guys to find it there. So this is simply just a WordPress that we've started. It's a little bit bare bones at the moment, but we're going to be adding a lot of content soon, so no worries about that. Just now, you can get all episodes of the Scottish History Podcast that we've currently made on there, with little bios as well. And basically, we started the website so we could post things that we either couldn't do in the podcast, or maybe a little research blog or a travel blog, or if we find something interesting that we want to share with you guys but we can't do it on a podcast, we can put it on the blog there. Like I was saying with the letters that I was using this episode, they can go in the blog there and you guys can read the full things rather than just having the paraphrasing that I've put in the episode there. So that's www.scottishhistorypodcast.com. So check it out there for all the other content. And you might also notice as well that the quality has hopefully improved somewhat. Got a new microphone, which is pretty sweet, so the quality of the episodes is going to improve quite drastically from now on, and we're working towards just making them sound even better and have even better content for you guys. So again, I hope you enjoyed listening, and see you next time.